My name is Janet Vitt, and I'm from Ohio, and I'm a cancer survivor. In April of 1995, I was having a little bit of heaviness in my chest. I had no other symptoms whatsoever. I'm a registered nurse, and at the hospital I was working at, I had a couple of the physicians listen to my lungs every day, thinking that I had maybe bronchitis or something, and each of them said, "Oh, your lungs are clear, there's nothing there." And the next day I would have someone else listen because although I had no other symptoms, I just felt like someone was pushing on my chest. And nope, each day they would say there's nothing in your lungs, they're clear. So I asked a friend of mine who lives in the village where I live, and we play tennis together, if he would give me an antibiotic. I said, I am sure I have bronchitis, I just have this heaviness in my lungs. And he said, okay, and he wrote me out a prescription for an antibiotic, but he said, on Monday when you go back to work, get a chest x-ray. Let's make sure you don't have pneumonia. So I went to work. I took the antibiotic over the weekend, and I went to work on Monday, and I had the chest x-ray, and my friend, the physician, called, and he said, there is a mass in your left lung. I thought, oh, he's mistaken. I'm a healthy person. I couldn't have a mass in my lung. Well, we scanned me that afternoon, put me on a CAT scan, to find that there were 3 tumors in my left lung, 7 in my right lung, 3 tumors in my liver, 1 in my pancreas, a mass in my abdomen, and then 2 days later we did a bronchoscopy, a test that they do. They put a tube down your throat and they take biopsies, and the cancer was also in my lymph system. I was positive for small cell adenocarcinoma. The first oncologist felt it was lung primary and that I would probably live 3 to 6 months. I said, he was a friend of mine, he worked at the hospital where I work, and I said, oh, you're mistaken, I'm not so sick. I don't think that I'm that sick. So I said, I'm going to get a second opinion. And he said to me, that was a good idea, get a second opinion. So I went to a major cancer center in the Cleveland area where I live, and the oncologist I saw there, he felt that my cancer was pancreatic primary because it had spread so quickly throughout my body. And he said that I would probably only live 3 to 6 weeks. So I didn't like him at all. I liked, at least the first oncologist was going to give me a couple months to live. I went back to the original oncologist at the hospital where I worked as a nurse, and I said, what can I do? I don't want to die. He said, there's some experimental chemotherapy that I could try. It would not save my life, but it could extend my life maybe a month. This was the beginning of April of 1995, and my son's birthday was at the end of May. And by now, this was the realization that I needed, that I really was dying, that I was very sick. So I said, all right, I will try this 1 dose of experimental chemo. Actually, he wanted me to take 5 doses, but I thought, well, I'll take it 1 step at a time. I did the 1 dose of chemo. They infused chemotherapy for 24 hours. It was Taxol and carboplatin. Within 3 weeks of receiving that chemo, I had lost 1/3 of my weight, which was 42 pounds. I used to weigh 118 pounds. I went down to 72 pounds. We knew I could never do a second dose of chemo. I was violently nauseous. I vomited day and night. So at 72 pounds, and I'm 5'6", I was very thin. I had no hair left. I did keep my eyebrows. And my general practitioner, the internist who was my primary care physician, suggested that I try some alternative healing. And he said, had I heard about macrobiotics? Even as a nurse, I had not heard about macrobiotics. But my sister actually investigated it for me. By now I was very sick. My lungs had filled with fluid. I needed help to go to and from the bathroom. My friends were helping me. And she found a macrobiotic counselor for me, and he came to my home. My lungs were so full of fluid I could hardly breathe. It was very that kind of breathing, and I was on oxygen. And he said to me the most beautiful thing. First, he came into the home, and I must tell you how I felt when I first saw Francois, is his first name. He came into the home, and he's a very tall, slender man, and I thought, ooh, he's so skinny, I don't want to look like that. See, I was a very judgmental person before my cancer. But he came into the living room, and he looked at my hands, and he looked at my face, and he said to me, you could be healed. Those were the most beautiful words that I had ever heard in my life. Well, no, I have 2 sons. The most beautiful words are, it's a boy, it's a boy. I'd heard that twice. But besides that was, you could be healed. And he told me about the macrobiotic diet, about eating grains and vegetables and sea vegetables, which I'd never heard of before, and miso soup. So we started on that diet, Actually, it was June 8th, we started on the diet, and 8 of my friends and my sister cooked for me. I was so weak, on the oxygen. Hospice was now in my home. I had signed my do not resuscitate papers, in that if I were to stop breathing, they were not to call a physician or a doctor or the ambulance, that just let me die. And this was very hard for my sons because, of course, they didn't want to let go of me, and I didn't want to let go of them. But I didn't think that there would be a way out. I couldn't imagine that changing the way I eat would heal something as ugly as cancer. But I did want to live. So as all my friends were cooking for me, and I was so ill, I ate just a tiny bit. I would have a couple teaspoons of miso soup and a couple teaspoons of rice. And I did chew and chew and chew. Francois told me how important it was to chew. Because my breathing was so labored, very difficult, it would take me a half hour to eat just those 3 teaspoons of soup and 3 teaspoons of rice. But I stayed on, and in the meantime, my lungs kept filling up with fluid. And I would go into the hospital, and they would drain the fluid. So I did need some Western medicine with my Eastern philosophy. And as they drained my lungs, they would take an x-ray. Frequently after they do it's called a thoracentesis, they tap the lungs and pull fluid out. They do a chest x-ray to see if the lung has collapsed. People will get a pneumothorax after their lungs are tapped. Fortunately, by the grace of God, I never had a pneumothorax, but we could see that my tumors were shrinking. Although they were still producing fluid, the tumors were shrinking. Well, this kept going on and going on, and I called, and I started bringing up thick mucus. And I called my physician, and he said that was related to the tumors in my lungs. And then I called Francois, my counselor, and he said, oh, this is wonderful, wonderful. The tumors are releasing, they're breaking up, and you're losing them. And what would happen is my lungs would fill with fluid, and as they filled with fluid, my mouth would fill with mucus. And I had to pull this mucus out of my mouth. It was thick mucus, like cheese. And I bring this up because cheese was my biggest addiction. I like dairy food, ice cream too, but cheese, every day I ate cheese. And in macrobiotics, we don't eat cheese. So my lungs were getting rid of this cheese. So although Western medicine felt, oh, it's the tumors producing all this mucus, macrobiotics felt you're detoxing, you're getting rid of all this stuff that you have built up over years and years in your lungs. And it was a positive thing. I enjoyed that. So instead of being embarrassed by all this mucus that came out of my mouth, I looked at it as something positive. It still was disgusting. I mean, thick mucus out of my mouth, but it was positive.